There comes a moment, often quiet, often disguised as crisis, when the soul begins to shift beneath the surface of ordinary life. Carl Jung understood that the psyche doesn't evolve through external achievement alone, but through inner alignment, confrontation with the shadow, and the emergence of the self. What appears on the surface as confusion, restlessness, or the breakdown of old patterns is rarely random. These are not signs of failure, they are signals that transformation is near. In this lecture, we explore the archetypal signs that you're standing on the threshold of your most authentic and life-giving stage, yet not merely a season of comfort or success, but one in which the soul leads, not the ego. Jung believed that the best stage of life is not defined by how much we gain, but by how deeply we know ourselves. When the unconscious stirs, when synchronicities increase, when suffering gives way to clarity, the self is beginning to emerge. You are not losing your way, you are shedding what no longer belongs. This stage is not given, it is earned through the honest confrontation with your inner world, and the signs, subtle, sacred, and symbolic, are already whispering to you. The invitation is here. The question is, will you listen? A growing discomfort with your old identity signals the ego's loosening grip and the self's emergence. In Jungian psychology, identity is not a fixed structure but a dynamic interplay between the ego, the persona, the shadow, and the deeper self. Most people spend the first half of their lives developing an ego identity that allows them to function in the world, to achieve, to belong, to gain approval, to survive. This ego identity is often built on inherited values, cultural expectations, and roles assigned early in life. It is not false, but it is incomplete. Jung observed that at some point, often catalyzed by inner restlessness or external disruption, the carefully constructed identity begins to feel tight, outdated, or even hollow. What once gave a person meaning or motivation no longer satisfies. The career that once felt purposeful now feels mechanical. Relationships maintained out of habit or obligation begin to feel disconnected. Goals that once drove ambition begin to lose their emotional charge. This discomfort is not a psychological failure, it is a sacred sign. The ego is designed to maintain stability, to preserve the known. When it begins to lose its grip, it resists. It may create anxiety, depression, confusion, or even physical symptoms as it fights to reassert control. But from a Jungian perspective, these symptoms are not pathology, they are the soul's protest against living inauthentically. The discomfort is the beginning of a shift from ego consciousness to self. The self, in Jungian terms, is the totality of the psyche, the center and circumference of one's being. It contains both conscious and unconscious material, both light and shadow. When the self begins to emerge, it does not do so with fanfare or clarity. It arrives as a whisper in the margins of thought, a subtle dissatisfaction, a longing that cannot be named. It disrupts the ego not to destroy it, but to liberate it from its narrow self-definition. The process of shedding an old identity is often painful. It involves grieving not just what was lost, but what was never real to begin with. People begin to realize that they have lived according to scripts written by others' parents, religion, culture, peers. They see that they have betrayed parts of themselves in the name of acceptance, comfort, or tradition. This realization can be destabilizing. The ground beneath their feet begins to crack. The person may feel like they are unraveling, but this unraveling is necessary. Jung likened it to the dissolution stage of alchemy solution, where the ego is dissolved so that a more integrated form can take shape. The discomfort is not the end, it is the beginning of something more honest, more whole, more true. One of the key signs that this transition is taking place is a shift in values. Things that once seemed important, status, appearance, approval, begin to lose their grip. The person begins to seek meaning over success, truth over popularity, depth over comfort. This shift is not necessarily dramatic. It may happen quietly. Gradually, a sudden disinterest in gossip, a growing curiosity about philosophy or spirituality, a desire to spend more time alone, in nature or in reflection. These changes are not escapism, they are recalibrations of the psyche toward what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming the person you are uniquely meant to be. The ego does not lead this process. It must learn to follow. As the discomfort with the old identity grows, so too does the presence of the unconscious. Dreams may become more vivid or symbolic. Long-forgotten memories may rise to the surface. Emotional reactions may intensify or seem disproportionate. These are all signals that the unconscious is asserting itself. That material which has long been buried or denied is now seeking integration. Jung believed that the psyche is self-dilating. It will not allow the false self to dominate indefinitely. The discomfort is the psyche's way of creating tension, what he called creative suffering that leads to inner expansion. If one listens carefully, this discomfort begins to guide rather than hinder. It points toward what is incomplete, unlived, or unacknowledged. It invites the person to begin the inner work of reclaiming their wholeness. This phase often brings with it a sense of existential questioning. The person begins to ask, sometimes for the first time, who am I, really? Not in the roles they perform, not in the titles they hold, but in essence. This question cannot be answered with words alone. It must be lived. The discomfort is the soul's way of initiating that journey. The journey requires courage, because it involves stepping away from the familiar into the unknown. It requires faith, not in doctrines, but in the deeper intelligence of the psyche. The person must learn to trust the process, even when it feels chaotic or unclear. They must allow the old identity to die, without knowing what will take its place. There is often a tension between the old self and the emerging self. The person may swing back and forth, one day feeling clarity, the next day panic, one moment embracing change, the next clinging to what is safe. Jung saw this as part of the natural rhythm of transformation. The psyche does not evolve in a straight line. It moves in spirals, revisiting old wounds, re-examining old choices, revealing deeper truths over time. The discomfort is the energy that drives this spiral. It keeps the person moving, seeking, awakening. Without it, there would be no incentive to change. People around the individual may not understand what is happening. They may interpret the discomfort as midlife crisis, rebellion, depression, or irrationality. But Jung knew that individuation often isolates before it connects. It separates before it The person must be willing to walk alone for a while, to endure misunderstanding, to follow an inner compass that others cannot see. They must resist the temptation to go back to sleep, to numb the discomfort, to pretend everything is fine. Because everything is not fine, not in the old identity. The old self is too small for who they are becoming. This stage is often accompanied by an increase in synchronicities, those meaningful coincidences that Jung saw as signs of alignment between the outer world and the inner process. A book appears with exactly the message they needed. A stranger speaks words that answer an unspoken question. These events are not random. They are signals that the self is beginning to organize reality around the process of transformation. They affirm the discomfort, confirming that it is not a breakdown but a breakthrough. They remind the person that they are being guided, even when they cannot yet see the destination. Ultimately, the discomfort with the old identity is not a flaw or a detour. It is the call to awakening. It is the invitation to begin the best stage of life, one in which the person no longer lives from the outside in, but from the inside out, where choices are made not from fear or obligation, but from inner alignment, where success is measured not by achievement, but by authenticity, where the self becomes the axis of being, and life begins to unfold not as a performance, but as a revelation. This discomfort is the first ripple in the still surface of ego consciousness, the sign that something deeper has stirred. It is the cracking of the shell, the moment before emergence, the ache that signals birth. It is not a sign that something is wrong, it is the sign that everything is finally beginning to become right. You begin to withdraw projections and face your shadow without fear or denial. In the framework of Carl Jung's psychology, this marks a critical turning point in a person's journey toward individuation, the process of becoming whole. Projection is one of the ego's earliest and most habitual defenses. It enables us to attribute disowned qualities, especially those we find unacceptable or threatening, onto other people, institutions, or groups. Through projection, the psyche unconsciously attempts to rid itself of internal conflict by locating the conflict outside of itself. This allows the ego to maintain its image of righteousness, order, or innocence. But while projection protects the ego, it also prevents growth. As long as the unwanted parts of the self are seen as external threats, the individual cannot access the deeper truths required for wholeness. The withdrawal of projection is not an intellectual decision, it is an emotional and spiritual awakening. It begins when a person notices repetitive emotional responses that no longer make sense. They begin to question their own reactions instead of blaming others. They catch themselves in judgment and ask, what part of me is being activated right now? This shift from external blame to internal inquiry is subtle but revolutionary. It signifies the ego's willingness to surrender its illusions and begin the process of integration. It means that the person is now strong enough, conscious enough, and humble enough to hold complexity without collapse. Instead of needing others to carry their disowned rage, envy, fear, or shame, they begin to acknowledge those emotions within their own psyche. This is not an act of self-punishment, it is an act of self-possession. The person reclaims what was lost, disowned, or denied. Facing the shadow is one of the most courageous acts a human being can undertake. The shadow contains everything the ego has rejected in order to maintain its identity. These are not just negative traits. The shadow may also contain suppressed talents, creativity, sexuality, and power. What defines the shadow is not its moral value but its incompatibility with the conscious self-image. When a person begins to withdraw projections, they begin to feel the weight of this shadow material. It may appear in dreams, through symbols or threatening figures. It may emerge in waking life as sudden anger, irrational sadness, or discomfort around certain people. These are signs that the unconscious is offering material for integration. Jung did not view these intrusions as disturbances. He saw them as invitations. The psyche is attempting to make whole what has been split. The individual who begins to face their shadow without fear or denial begins to see themselves in others, not just their light, but their darkness. They realize that what they once judged in others' arrogance, neediness, manipulation are also tendencies within their own nature. This recognition does not excuse destructive behavior in others, but it dissolves the illusion of separation. It creates empathy. It opens the heart. The person no longer needs to elevate themselves by condemning others. They begin to speak with honesty rather than righteousness, to listen with curiosity rather than defense. The more they own their projections, the more freedom they feel. They are no longer triggered by the external world in the same way. They begin to respond instead of react. This process can be deeply disorienting. The self-image that the ego has worked so hard to maintain may begin to crumble. The person may feel ashamed of what they discover in themselves, resentment they've denied, jealousy they've hidden, cruelty they've masked with charm. But Jung taught that shame is the beginning of transformation, not the end. It is the sign that the ego has encountered the truth of its own limitation, and in that encounter, a deeper self begins to stir. Not a perfect self, but a real one capable of complexity, contradiction, and compassion. One rooted in authenticity rather than appearance. Withdrawing projection also brings new clarity to relationships. The person begins to see others more clearly, without the distortion of their own inner material. They are no longer searching for a savior, a villain, or a scapegoat. They relate to others as whole people, not as characters in their unconscious narrative. This brings both relief and responsibility. It is easier to blame others than to take ownership, but it is also profoundly liberating. The person becomes less dependent on external validation. They no longer need others to carry the burden of their unlived self. They begin to cultivate relationships based on mutual respect rather than unconscious need. As this process deepens, the individual begins to experience greater emotional freedom. They are not as easily offended. They are not as easily overwhelmed. They can sit with difficult emotions without needing to act them out or project them onto others. This emotional regulation is not repression, it is containment. It is the result of inner spaciousness, the capacity to hold multiple truths at once. Jung referred to this as holding the tension of the opposites. The person begins to understand that growth does not come from choosing between good and bad, but from integrating what was once seen as incompatible. They begin to live from the center of the self rather than the edges of the ego. This phase often brings an increased interest in symbolic life. Dreams, synchronicities, art, and mythology take on new significance. The unconscious is no longer feared but welcomed. The person develops an inner dialogue with the depths of their psyche. They begin to trust the wisdom that emerges from within. They no longer need external authorities to define their path. They begin to discern the difference between projection and intuition. They begin to walk in alignment with their inner truth. Facing the shadow also means confronting past wounds. Projections are often defenses against unhealed pain. As the person withdraws projection, they may encounter old traumas, unmet needs, or forgotten memories. These must be faced with gentleness and care. The goal is not to relive the pain but to understand its impact, to grieve what was lost, to offer the self the compassion it never received. This is deep healing. It is not fast or easy, but it is real. It creates a foundation of inner solidity that cannot be shaken by external chaos. One of the final gifts of this process is integrity. The person no longer splits their life into compartments. They are the same person in public and in private. They speak the truth, not because it is comfortable, but because it is necessary. They no longer pretend to be something they are not. They no longer demand perfection of themselves or others. They live in alignment with their values, their wounds, and their purpose. They are not finished, they are human, but they are honest. And from that honesty, real transformation flows. The withdrawal of projection and the confrontation with the shadow mark the beginning of authentic adulthood, not measured by age, but by inner maturity. This is the point at which a person stops trying to be good and starts trying to be whole. It is the point where they trade comfort for depth, certainty for curiosity, judgment for compassion. This is the passage into the best stage of life, not because it is easy or painless, but because it is true, it is grounded, it is real, and it opens the door to a life that is not ruled by fear, shame, or illusion, but guided by conscious choice and the sacred unfolding of the self. Recurring symbols, dreams, and synchronicities increase, guiding you toward deeper purpose. In Carl Jung's understanding of the psyche, the unconscious is not merely a repository of repressed material or forgotten memories, but a dynamic and intelligent realm filled with archetypal images, symbolic language, and messages that seek to move the individual toward wholeness. When a person begins to shift from an ego-centered life to a soul-oriented one, the unconscious responds. It begins to send signals patterns that emerge with increasing clarity and frequency, designed not to confuse or frighten but to awaken, to redirect, and to initiate a deeper journey inward. These signs often manifest in the form of recurring dreams, symbols, and synchronicities. To the rational mind, these occurrences may seem strange, irrelevant, or coincidental, but to the symbolic mind, which Jung saw as essential to individuation, they are profound indicators that the psyche is speaking. Dreams are among the most direct forms of communication from the unconscious. Jung viewed them not as random neural firings, but as meaningful narratives constructed by the deeper self to compensate, correct, or enhance the conscious mind's understanding. When a person is on the threshold of major inner transformation, dreams often become more vivid, emotionally charged, and repetitive. Symbols such as water, fire, serpents, paths, doors, or mirrors begin to appear with greater frequency. Figures from mythology, childhood, or the personal past may resurface in dreamscapes not as literal characters, but as archetypal energies seeking recognition. These dreams are not mere psychological noise, they are maps. They provide orientation. During the liminal phase between the death of the old self and the birth of the new, one may dream repeatedly of climbing stairs, descending into caves, walking through forests, or losing teeth, all of which carry rich symbolic meaning. Climbing suggests aspiration or spiritual ascent. Descending implies confrontation with the unconscious. Forests may represent the unknown or the wild inner terrain. Losing teeth may indicate fear of losing control or identity. Jung believed that when such images repeat, the psyche is emphasizing a theme that consciousness has not yet integrated. The recurrence is the unconscious saying, "Pay attention." When these symbols are engaged, not analyzed to death, but felt, explored, and honored, they begin to reveal their meaning. They become allies rather than puzzles, guiding the person inward toward areas of disconnection, wounding, or potential. Symbols are not confined to dreams. They begin to appear in waking life, embedded in the fabric of ordinary experience. A specific animal keeps crossing your path. A book falls off the shelf with exactly the insight you needed. A stranger speaks words that echo a private thought you had earlier that day. These are not mere coincidences. They are Jung defined synchronicity as the causal connecting principle, the experience of two or more events that are meaningfully related, though not causally linked. Unlike logical cause and effect, synchronicity belongs to the realm of meaning. It points to a deeper order, a hidden harmony between the inner world and the outer world. When a person is in alignment with their individuation process, synchronicities tend to increase, not because the universe changes, but because the individual becomes more attuned to the symbolic language of the psyche. These synchronistic events serve as confirmations. They validate inner insights, mark energetic shifts, and illuminate decisions that feel intuitively right but lack rational explanation. You might be struggling with a life decision, and then overhear a conversation that mirrors your exact dilemma, offering unexpected clarity. Or you might repeatedly see a specific number or symbol during a period of inner transition, and when investigated, it aligns perfectly with your current emotional or spiritual state. Jung believed that the psyche communicates through these symbolic echoes, gently nudging the individual forward, drawing them into a participatory relationship with the mystery of life. This symbolic awareness is not a form of magical thinking or superstition. Rather, it is a heightened sensitivity to the field of meaning in which we are all embedded. When a person begins to open to their deeper purpose, they no longer view life as a series of unrelated events. They begin to sense that something larger is moving through them. Life starts to feel orchestrated, not in a deterministic way, but in a soulful way. There is a sense of being led, not controlled, but invited. This shift in perception is itself a sign of inner readiness. The person is no longer living on the surface of life. They are listening, watching, sensing. They are willing to follow the thread, even when they don't yet know where it leads. The symbolic realm requires a different kind of attention, one that is poetic rather than analytical, intuitive rather than mechanistic. Jung often encouraged people to journal their dreams, create art from their inner images, explore myths and fairy tales that resonate with their current experiences. These practices help develop what he called symbolic consciousness, the ability to live in relationship with the inner world and to find meaning in its expressions. The more one cultivates this awareness, the more the unconscious begins to respond. A dialogue is established between the ego and the self, between the personal and the archetypal, between the seen and the unseen. This inner dialogue does not always bring comfort. Sometimes recurring symbols and dreams confront the person with truths they would rather avoid. A shadow figure keeps appearing in dreams. A destructive pattern plays out repeatedly. These are not punishments, but prompts. They are the psyche's way of saying, there is more to see here. Do not look away. And when the person does not look away, when they engage the discomfort rather than deny it, something extraordinary happens. The symbol begins to change. The dream evolves. The synchronicities shift in tone. The inner landscape begins to transform, not because the outer world has changed, but because the inner world has. This transformation is not forced. It unfolds organically, in its own time, according to the rhythm of the soul. The recurrence of symbols, dreams, and synchronicities is not a to-do list. It is a living process. It is the self-signaling that the best stage of life is not something to be built from the outside, but something to be received from within. It is not about becoming someone else. It is about becoming more deeply who you already are. The unconscious does not reveal everything at once. It gives only what the person is ready to receive. Each symbol is a doorway, each dream a message, each synchronicity a mirror. Together they form a sacred cartography of the soul's journey, one that leads, if followed with sincerity and courage, to the very center of meaning, purpose, and wholeness. Relationships shift as you gravitate toward authenticity and away from unconscious roles. In Carl Jung's framework of individuation, the process through which a person becomes whole and fully themselves, relationships play a vital and revealing role. They serve as mirrors, containers, and pressure points through which the unconscious becomes visible. Often, the roles we play in our relationships are not chosen from consciousness, but shaped by deep psychological imprints. The need to be approved, to belong, to avoid abandonment, to maintain power, or to remain invisible. These roles, formed in early life and reinforced by culture, shape the way we connect with others. We become the caretaker, the peacemaker, the rescuer, the rebel, the victim, or the overachiever, not because these identities reflect our true self, but because they help us survive emotionally. Over time, however, something within begins to resist the falseness. The performance becomes heavy, the masks begin to slip, and the soul begins to yearn for connection that is rooted in truth rather than conditioning. This yearning marks the beginning of a sacred shift. As the self begins to emerge, the individual can no longer tolerate roles that were once unconscious strategies. The relationships that used to feel comfortable start to feel confining. There's an inner pull to honesty, even if it brings discomfort. The desire to keep the peace gives way to the need to speak one's truth. The compulsion to be liked is challenged by the desire to be real. This change does not come with ease. It often leads to tension, distance, or even rupture in relationships that were built on mutual projections. When one person begins to wake up to their truth, those who are still invested in the old roles may feel threatened. They may resist the change, attempt to guilt or manipulate, or withdraw altogether. This can be painful, but it is also necessary. Jung understood that individuation requires separation not as abandonment, but as differentiation. It is the process of becoming who you are, apart from the expectations and emotional entanglements that once defined you. This doesn't mean withdrawing from all relationships, but it does mean stepping back from relationships that require you to deny yourself. It means refusing to play roles that keep others comfortable at the expense of your own soul. This process is not an act of selfishness, but of integrity. When a person stops performing and begins to live from their authentic self, their relationships must either evolve or dissolve. Some people will rise to meet the new you. They will celebrate your growth, engage your depth, and begin their own journey toward truth. Others will cling to the version of you that suited their needs. They may accuse you of changing, becoming distant, or being selfish, but their reaction reveals more about their own resistance to change than about your path. Authentic connection requires vulnerability, not performance. It demands that both people bring their whole selves to the table, flaws, fears, contradictions, and all. This level of honesty can feel risky, especially for those who are used to hiding behind roles. But it is also the gateway to real intimacy. When you are no longer trying to impress, control, fix, or protect, you begin to listen, you begin to feel, you begin to see the other not as a projection of your needs or fears, but as a soul on their own journey. This shift in perception creates space for compassion, curiosity, and communion. It also creates boundaries, not the kind made of walls, but the kind made of clarity. You begin to know what you are available for and what you are not. You begin to honor your energy, your needs, and your truth. This may mean walking away from relationships that are built on dependency, manipulation, or avoidance. It may mean grieving the loss of connections that once felt essential. But in that loss you reclaim yourself. One of the key aspects of this transformation is the recognition of projection in relationships. Jung taught that we do not see others as they are, we see them as we are. We project our unmet needs, unresolved wounds, and hidden desires onto those closest to us. This is especially true in romantic relationships, where the intensity of emotion often masks the depth of projection. When we idealize someone, we are projecting our own disowned qualities onto them. When we demonize someone, we are often encountering our shadow. As we begin to withdraw projections, we see others more clearly, not as heroes or villains, but as complex, imperfect, evolving beings. This clarity allows us to take responsibility for our part in the relational dynamic. It allows us to own our triggers, name our needs, and relate from a place of sovereignty rather than dependency. As relationships shift, so does your understanding of love. Love is no longer about attachment, possession, or rescue. It becomes a force that liberates rather than entangles. You begin to recognize that love is not about merging into sameness, but about witnessing and supporting each other's individuation. This may challenge everything you've been taught about connection. It may unsettle old beliefs about sacrifice, obligation, and loyalty. But it also opens the door to a love that is spacious, honest, and enduring. A love that is not based on illusion, but on truth. These relational shifts also affect how you show up in community, work, and family. You begin to speak from your center rather than from your conditioning. You no longer agree to what drains you, pretend to enjoy what bores you, or say yes when you mean no. You are no longer willing to betray your soul for the sake of harmony. This may create friction in systems that rely on conformity. But it also creates possibility. When one person chooses truth, they create space for others to do the same. Your authenticity becomes an invitation. Not everyone will accept it, but those who do will meet you in the place where real connection begins. This stage of relational transformation is not linear. It unfolds in layers. You may revisit old patterns, fall back into familiar roles, or struggle with guilt. That is part of the process. What matters is awareness. The more conscious you become, the less power those old patterns hold. The more you honor your truth, the more aligned your relationships become. Over time, you begin to attract people who resonate with your authentic frequency. You begin to feel seen, not for the mask you wear, but for the soul you are. And in that seeing, a new kind of love is born, not the love that demands, but the love that frees. These shifts are not signs of isolation. They are signs of alignment. They mark the passage from performance to presence, from role to reality, from unconscious entanglement to conscious connection. They are proof that your inner world is becoming more coherent, more integrated, and more alive. As your relationships reflect this inner shift, they become spaces of growth rather than confinement, dialogue rather than domination, evolution rather than repetition. You are no longer seeking safety in the familiar. You are seeking truth in the unknown. You are no longer molding yourself to fit. You are allowing yourself to unfold. In doing so, you step into the best stage of your life, not one free from conflict or loss, but one rooted in authenticity, depth, and love that reflects the wholeness within. Suffering starts to feel meaningful, revealing the alchemical process of transformation. In the early stages of personal growth, suffering is usually experienced as a disruption, something to be avoided. suppressed, or quickly escaped. It is interpreted by the ego as a sign of failure, weakness, or loss of control. But as the process of individuation begins to unfold, and the self starts to emerge from behind the ego's constructs, suffering is recontextualized. It is no longer viewed as meaningless pain, but as an initiation into a deeper awareness. Jung understood suffering not as a punishment or a flaw in the human design, but as a necessary catalyst for inner evolution. He compared psychological transformation to alchemy, the ancient mystical practice of transmuting base materials into gold. In this symbolic framework, suffering is the prima materia, the raw chaotic substance from which wholeness is eventually born. This shift in perception does not happen overnight. It often begins with a sense that the pain one is experiencing carries a message, that it is not random but significant. The emotional breakdown, the failed relationship, the loss of direction, all of it begins to glow with symbolic weight. The individual senses, often without knowing why, that the suffering is pointing toward something essential. They begin to resist less and reflect more. Instead of numbing or distracting themselves, they turn inward. They begin to ask deeper questions, not just about what is happening, but about what the experience is asking of them. This curiosity marks the beginning of the alchemical process. It is the first moment the soul is heard beneath the noise of the ego. Suffering, when consciously embraced, breaks down the rigid structures of identity. It exposes the illusions, attachments, and personas that were once mistaken for truth. It cracks open the psyche, allowing light to reach the hidden, neglected corners of the self. Jung observes that people are not transformed by bliss alone, but by conscious confrontation with their own darkness. The ego resists this process because it involves the death of its certainty, its control, its image. But the self thrives on authenticity, even when it emerges through sorrow, disillusionment, or chaos. When a person allows themselves to suffer consciously, they enter into a sacred fire, one that burns away what is false, leaving only what is real. This does not mean glorifying pain or seeking suffering for its own sake. It means recognizing suffering as a teacher, an oracle, a crucible for transformation. It means engaging with the emotions. It brings grief, rage, despair, confusion, not to be consumed by them, but to listen. What is the grief saying about what was lost? What does the rage reveal about betrayal or boundaries? What does the despair illuminate about disconnection from meaning? Each emotion becomes a guidepost, a symbol, a thread that leads deeper into the labyrinth of the soul. And it is in that labyrinth that the gold is hidden, not on the surface of comfort, but in the depths of what was once feared. As this process deepens, the individual begins to feel a paradoxical sense of clarity within their suffering. The pain is still present, but it is no longer senseless. It begins to feel like a rite of passage, painful, yes, but purposeful. This shift is subtle but profound. It does not remove the difficulty, but it alters the meaning. The person begins to see that the suffering has stripped them of illusions they didn't know they were clinging to. It has revealed truths that no amount of success or comfort could have delivered. It has opened their eyes to the deeper dimensions of life, the spiritual, the symbolic, the eternal. In alchemical terms, this is the stage of nigredo, the blackening, the dissolution of old structures. It is followed by albedo, the whitening, the clarification of new insight. Then comes rubedo, the reddening, the integration of spirit and matter, soul and body, meaning and life. This ancient symbolic process mirrors the psychological stages of deep transformation. The initial suffering brings everything into question. Then comes illumination through dreams, intuition, or synchronistic encounters. Finally, there is integration, a new sense of self that holds the opposites together. This is not a linear journey, and it often loops back on itself. But once a person has begun to experience suffering in symbolic terms, they are never quite the same. They develop a reverence for their pain, not a worship, but a recognition of its necessity. This symbolic relationship with suffering also transforms how the individual relates to others. They become less judgmental, more empathetic. They understand that beneath the surface of every person is a hidden struggle, a silent grief, an unspoken fear. They no longer need to fix others or rescue them from their pain. They know that transformation requires descent, that healing is not always immediate, and that presence is often more powerful than advice. They begin to carry a kind of spiritual authority, not loud or boastful, but quiet and rooted. Others feel it. They feel safe in the presence of someone who has suffered consciously, because they sense the depth, the humility, the truth that radiates from within. There is also a deepening connection to archetypes during this phase. The person may feel aligned with the wounded healer, the phoenix, the hermit, or the warrior not as abstract ideas, but as living energies within the psyche. These archetypes provide a language for what is unfolding. They offer structure to the inner chaos. They remind the individual that their suffering is not isolated but universal. They are part of a larger myth, a collective story of death and rebirth, of loss and revelation, of descent and return. This connection to mythic consciousness expands the person's sense of identity. They are no longer just someone who is hurting. They are someone who is being initiated. This sense of initiation becomes stronger as the suffering begins to alchemize into wisdom. The person starts to share their experience not from a place of woundedness, but from a place of integration. Their story becomes medicine, their presence a balm. They may find themselves drawn to service, to creativity, to new expressions of purpose. This is not the ego seeking validation, but the self-expressing wholeness. The suffering that once felt like a curse becomes the very foundation of their strength. It becomes the place from which they speak truth, offer guidance, and embody love. They also begin to trust life in a new way, not because life is predictable or safe, but because they have met its depths and survived. They know that even in darkness there is meaning, even in pain there is presence, even in loss there is rebirth. This trust is not naive, it is earned through fire. It is a trust that rests not on surface outcomes but on inner alignment. It is a trust that allows them to face the unknown with open hands, to say yes to life even when it hurts, to remain open when the world demands they close. This is the sign that they have begun the best stage of their life, not because the suffering has ended, but because it has been integrated, not because life has become easier, but because it has become more meaningful, not because they have escaped pain, but because they have learned how to walk through it with grace, awareness, and courage. Silence, solitude, and inner stillness become fertile rather than frightening. In the early stages of psychological development, especially when the ego is still fragile and overly dependent on external validation, silence is often experienced as emptiness, solitude as abandonment, and stillness as a threat to the identity constructed by constant movement, noise, and distraction. But in the process of individuation, as described by Carl Jung, these inner qualities begin to shift in meaning and become essential components of transformation. Silence is no longer seen as void, but as a medium in which the voice of the deeper self can be heard. Solitude is no longer exile, but sacred retreat. Stillness is no longer stagnation, but the state in which unconscious material can rise, settle, and find integration. This shift does not come easily. The modern psyche is conditioned to avoid stillness. In a world saturated by stimulation, productivity, and performance, moments of quiet can feel like failure. People are trained to equate worth with action, presence with interaction, and relevance with visibility. Silence is feared because it exposes the mind to itself. In silence, the internal dialogue becomes louder, the unresolved pain begins to surface, the shadow becomes more visible. Solitude is resisted because it strips away the social roles that provide identity. When alone, one cannot hide behind status, relationships, or routines. Stillness is avoided because it disrupts momentum and forces a confrontation with being rather than doing. Yet these states, when consciously embraced, open the door to the soul. They provide the conditions in which the self can emerge. When a person begins to enter the best stage of their life, they often report a growing desire to withdraw, not in depression or despair, but in longing. The outer world begins to feel too loud, too fast, too fragmented. The soul begins to call for inner space. The distractions that once filled time no longer satisfy. The endless scrolling, the crowded rooms, the compulsive busyness lose their appeal. Instead, there is a hunger for quiet, for deep listening, for reconnection with something more essential. This turning inward is not escapism, it is alignment. It reflects the psyche's need to restore balance, to recalibrate around truth rather than performance. It is the beginning of a sacred solitude, in which the individual meets their own presence with honesty and care. In this silence, the unconscious begins to speak, not with words, but with images, sensations, memories, and insights. Dreams become more vivid, intuition more precise. The ego, no longer bombarded by constant stimulation, begins to relax its grip. The inner world, once ignored or feared, reveals its beauty. The person begins to notice subtleties, the sound of breath, the rhythm of thought, the texture of emotion. They begin to feel the layers of their being, to sense the energies moving within. This heightened awareness is not forced, it arises naturally when space is made. The silence becomes a sanctuary, the the solitude a teacher, the stillness a path. One of the most transformative aspects of this stage is the discovery that one is not alone in solitude. What initially felt like emptiness reveals itself as presence. The person begins to sense an inner companion, the self, the divine, the inner guide, however they choose to name it. This presence is not a projection, but a felt reality. It brings a sense of calm, of support, of guidance. In the quiet, the individual realizes that they are connected to something larger than their personal narrative. They begin to trust the inner voice that arises in stillness. They begin to consult their intuition, not as a vague feeling, but as a source of deep knowing. Decisions are made not from urgency, but from alignment. Life begins to flow from the inside out. This transformation also affects how time is experienced. In stillness, time slows. The person becomes less reactive, more intentional. They stop rushing toward outcomes and begin to savor the present. They learn to dwell, to linger, to rest. This is not laziness or disengagement, it is presence. It is the ability to be with what is, without needing to change or escape it. This presence brings clarity. It reveals what matters and what doesn't. It sharpens discernment. The person no longer says yes out of obligation or fear. They begin to live by inner rhythm rather than external pressure. They become sovereign in their own life. The embrace of silence and solitude also deepens creativity. With distractions minimized and the inner world open, ideas begin to flow. The person may feel drawn to write, paint, move, sing, or build for approval, but for expression, the soul begins to speak through form. Jung often encouraged the use of creative expression as a way to engage the unconscious. He believed that symbols, images, and artistic acts could carry messages that words could not. In stillness, these expressions arise spontaneously. The person begins to create from the source, not from ego, ambition. The art becomes a mirror, a meditation, a revelation. It becomes a way to witness the self in motion. In silence, grief is also given space. The losses that were buried in noise begin to surface. The heartbreak, the regret, the uncried tears, these now have room to breathe. This is a sacred unfolding. It is not a regression, but a release. The person allows the past to move through them, not to punish, but to purify. In this grieving, they begin to reclaim parts of themselves that were lost. They begin to integrate the wounds. They begin to heal not by forgetting, but by honoring. This process deepens empathy. Having met their own pain in solitude, they become more compassionate with the pain of others. They no longer need to fix or rescue, they simply witness with presence and love. There is also a spiritual dimension to this stage. As the person becomes more attuned to silence, they begin to sense the sacred in the ordinary. They feel the divine in breath, in still water, in the rustling of leaves. They no longer seek spiritual experience in the dramatic, but in the everyday. Their spirituality becomes embodied, grounded, lived. They begin to trust that they are guided, not by doctrine, but by the wisdom that arises from within. This trust is not blind, it is tested and earned. It is rooted in experience. The person has faced the silence and found it full. They have met solitude and found it rich. They have touched stillness and found it alive. This phase also brings an inner resilience. Because the person has learned to be with themselves, they are less dependent on external affirmation. They do not crumble when misunderstood or judged. They do not panic when alone. They carry a center within them, a still point that anchors them through change. This center is not a rigid identity, it is a fluid presence. It adapts without losing essence. It moves without losing depth. It is the self, living quietly beneath the noise of personality and performance. And it becomes the foundation upon which the best stage of life is built. As silence, solitude, and stillness become more familiar, they begin to inform every part of life. The person speaks with more intention, listens with more depth, moves with more grace. Their energy is no longer scattered, but focused. Their presence becomes a gift. Others feel safe, seen, and slowed in their presence, not because they demand attention, but because they embody peace. They radiate coherence. They reflect back to others what is possible when one learns to be with oneself. The world may not understand this change. It may question the withdrawal, misinterpret the stillness, or pathologize the solitude, but the person no longer lives for external approval. They are no longer driven by performance or fear. They are guided by truth. They are anchored in presence. They are rooted in the self. And from this inner place, life begins to unfold in harmony, depth, and quiet power. You begin to live in alignment with your inner truth rather than external expectation. In the psychology of Carl Jung, this movement marks the core of individuation, the process by which a person becomes who they truly are, distinct from the masks they've worn and the roles they've inherited. For much of life, many people operate from a place of adaptation. They learn early on what is rewarded, what is safe, and what is acceptable in their family, culture, religion, or society. This adaptation becomes a form of survival, but it often costs them their authenticity. They suppress their instincts to fit into systems. They hide their desires to maintain peace. They abandon their inner compass to chase outer validation. Over time, this gap between the true self and the performed self creates dissonance and inner tension that manifests as anxiety, dissatisfaction, emptiness, or resentment. At first, it may seem like burnout or depression, but beneath it lies a deeper truth. The soul is suffocating under the weight of the false self as you begin the best stage of your life. This dissonance can no longer be ignored. Something inside refuses to keep pretending. You may not yet know exactly who you are, but you become painfully aware of who you are not. You start to feel a visceral rejection of what feels forced, fake, or performative. The praise that once excited you now feels hollow. The roles you played to gain acceptance begin to feel like costumes. Even your dreams may begin to change, not because they weren't meaningful, but because they were built on borrowed values. This awakening is not a rejection of the past, but a reckoning with it. You begin to sort through the influences that shaped you: family expectations, cultural norms, social comparisons, as which ones truly belong to you. This process is not an act of rebellion for its own sake. It is an act of remembrance. You are remembering the parts of you that were silenced, shamed, or forgotten. The passions you set aside to be practical, the opinions you withheld to be polite, the truths you hid to avoid rejection. Now, these parts begin to stir. They demand to be acknowledged. They may show up in your dreams, your longings, your frustrations, or your spontaneous urges. Jung believed that the psyche will continually attempt to restore wholeness, and it will use every means necessary: dreams, symptoms, relationships, crisis to bring the unconscious into awareness. When you begin to live in alignment with your inner truth, you are cooperating with this process. You are saying yes to the deeper self that has been calling you all along. Living from your inner truth does not mean you reject all external structures or obligations. It means you begin to engage them from a place of choice rather than compulsion. You no longer say yes to please others at the expense of your peace. You no longer agree to roles that diminish your voice. You begin to discern what is yours to carry and what is not. You may still work a conventional job, raise a family, participate in community, but you do so with consciousness, with agency, with soul. The outer form of your life may not look drastically different at first, but the inner orientation shifts completely. You are no longer living from the outside in, but from the inside out. This inner alignment creates coherence. Your thoughts, words, and actions begin to match. Your values are reflected in your daily choices. You stop performing and start embodying. You no longer need to explain yourself or convince others of your worth. You simply live it. This authenticity brings both freedom and friction. Freedom because you are no longer bound by the opinions or expectations of others. Friction because not everyone will understand or support your change. People who benefited from your compliance may resist your clarity. Systems that rewarded your conformity may reject your truth. But even in the face of resistance, you find strength in your own alignment. You are not being defiant, you are being real. As you begin to live more authentically, you may notice a shift in your energy. What once drained you now energizes you. What once excited you now exhausts you. You begin to listen to the subtle signals of your body and soul. You begin to trust your intuition not as a vague feeling, but as a deep knowing that rises when you are centered and present. You start to make decisions that reflect your integrity rather than your insecurity. These decisions may not always be logical to others, but they make sense to your soul, and in honoring them, you build self-trust. This trust becomes a foundation of your confidence, not bravado, but groundedness, not arrogance, but sovereignty. Sovereignty extends into your relationships. You no longer tolerate dynamics that require you to shrink, lie, or betray yourself. You begin to choose relationships that support your growth rather than manage your insecurities. You value connection, but not at the cost of your truth. You start to speak more clearly, set healthier boundaries, and listen more deeply. You are not trying to control others, nor are you letting them control you. You are learning to relate soul to soul, not role to role. This shift may narrow your circle, but it deepens your intimacy. The people who remain are those who see you, not just admire or use you. Living in alignment with your inner truth also changes your relationship with fear. You begin to see that fear is not always a signal to stop. It can be a sign you are stepping into unfamiliar but necessary territory. You learn to distinguish between the fear of danger and the fear of growth. The former protects you, the latter propels you. You start to take risks, not reckless ones, but soul-aligned ones. You speak when you used to stay silent. You try when you used to hesitate. You stand when you used to bend. These acts of courage do not mean you are fearless, they mean you are faithful to your truth. As this process deepens, you may find yourself returning to the simplicity of being. The need to prove, to achieve, to outperform begins to dissolve. You are no longer obsessed with becoming someone. You are devoted to being yourself. This beingness is not passive, it is potent. It radiates clarity, compassion, and quiet power. You become a presence in the world rather than a projection. You begin to create from your essence. Your work becomes an extension of your values. Your service flows from your gifts. Your art expresses your soul. Your voice carries the resonance of your inner alignment. Jung believed that the true self is not an ideal to be reached, but a reality to be revealed. It is not created through effort, but uncovered through surrender. When you live in alignment with your inner truth, you are no longer striving to be worthy. You are remembering that you already are. You begin to rest in your being, not because you are finished growing, but because you are rooted in your source. You understand that the journey of becoming is infinite, but the foundation of it is already within you. This stage of life is not without challenge, but it is filled with meaning. It is not free from uncertainty, but it is grounded in purpose. You may not always have answers, but you carry the compass of your truth. You walk with presence. You speak with clarity, you love with honesty, you create with freedom. You begin to live not as a reaction to the world, but as an expression of the soul. And in doing so, you discover the quiet joy, the fierce peace, and the steady power of a life aligned with your deepest self.